The dark red stain spread across the navy silk like a blooming bruise. Clara stood completely still. The cold seeped through the floor to ceiling glass walls of the 50th floor hallway, chilling the damp fabric against her skin. A single drop of Cabernet traced a slow, sticky path down her bare ankle. "Oh, my apologies," Elise said. Her voice was spun sugar, light and entirely devoid of regret. Elise Montgomery did not look like a woman who made mistakes. She stood bathed in the muted light of the corridor, draped in a backless crimson evening gown that cost more than the average employee's yearly salary. The diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist caught the light as she casually lowered her empty crystal glass. She was smiling, a small, polished, private smile meant only for the woman whose dress she had just ruined. From beyond the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom, the muffled sound of applause echoed. It was the 10th anniversary of Thorne Industries. Inside that glittering room, 500 elite guests were raising their glasses. 10 minutes ago, Clara's husband had stood at the podium. He had looked out at the sea of faces, bypassed the corner where Clara stood in her understated navy dress, and locked his eyes on the center table, on Elise. He had thanked the room for their support, and then, with a voice full of deep emotion, he had dedicated his success to his true inspiration. The woman who had returned to his life just when he needed her most. The room had cheered. Clara had quietly walked out. Elise had followed her. Now, the heavy ballroom doors pushed open. Julian Thorne stepped into the quiet hallway. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that Clara had picked out for him 2 months ago. The gold pocket watch tucked into his vest, a gift from Elise before she abandoned him 5 years ago, gleamed faintly. He was handsome in that sharp, arrogant way that demanded the world's forgiveness without ever asking for it. Julian's deep-set gray eyes swept over the scene. He saw the empty wine glass in Elise's hand. He saw the massive dark stain ruining the front of Clara's dress. He saw the faint smudge of mascara under Clara's tired hazel eyes. He did not walk toward his wife. He stepped directly to Elise, his hand naturally finding the curve of her waist. "Is everything all right?" He asked softly, his thumb brushing over the diamonds on her wrist. Clara stopped breathing. It was a physical reaction, a sudden tightening of the chest that left her lungs paralyzed. She did not scream. She did not throw herself at them. Instead, her right hand slipped into the deep pocket of her ruined dress, her fingers closing tightly around a cold, hard object, a vintage silver fountain pen. Her knuckles turned white. The cool metal dug into her palm, grounding her. It was the pen she carried everywhere. The pen she had used 3 years ago in a sterile lawyer's office to secretly sign away her own maternal inheritance to save Thorne Industries from bankruptcy when Julian was drowning in debt and despair. He did not know about that signature. He only knew that a silent investor had miraculously bailed him out. He thought his brilliance had saved the company. He thought Clara was just the quiet, dull woman who made his coffee and ironed his shirts while he rebuilt his empire. Clara tripped, Elise said, smoothly, leaning her weight slightly against Julian's shoulder. "I tried to catch her, but I spilled my drink. It was incredibly clumsy of us both." Julian sighed. It was the heavy, exhausted sigh of a man burdened by a disappointing child. He finally looked at Clara. There was no pity in his eyes, only a cold, polished irritation. "You are making a scene," Julian said, keeping his voice low to prevent the sound from carrying back into the ballroom. "I have not spoken a single word," Clara replied. Her voice surprised even her. It was not trembling. It was not thick with tears. It was terrifyingly flat. Julian's jaw tightened. "Look at yourself. You are stained. Your makeup is a mess. The board members are right inside. Clara, the press is downstairs. I cannot have you wandering the halls looking like a discarded afterthought. Reflects poorly on me, Dunk." "A discarded afterthought," Clara repeated slowly. She looked at his hand, still resting comfortably on Elisa's waist. 3 years. She had spent 3 years brewing his tea at midnight when he had panic attacks about the company's debt. She had spent 3 years wearing cheap clothes so he could maintain the illusion of wealth. She had poured her entire life, her entire hidden fortune, into the foundation he now stood upon. "Why did you come out here, Julian?" Clara asked, her hazel eyes locking onto his. "Did you come to see if I was all right, or did you come to make sure I wouldn't ruin her dress by bleeding on it?" "Do not be dramatic," Julian snapped, dropping his hand. From Elise, though, he did not step away from her. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture of profound impatience. "I came out here because Elise is right. This isn't working anymore. It hasn't been working for a long time." Elise offered a sympathetic, deeply condescending pout. "I'll give you 2 a moment," she whispered, touching Julian's chest lightly, before drifting back toward the ballroom doors. She did not look back. She didn't need to. She knew she had already won. The heavy doors clicked shut, leaving Julian and Clara alone in the glass hallway. Below them, the city lights glittered like scattered diamonds. "Go home, Clara?" Julian said quietly. The irritation was gone now, replaced by something much worse, pity. "My driver will take you. Pack your things tonight. I will make sure you are generously compensated. You won't have to worry about money." Clara's fingers traced the engraved silver barrel of the pen in her pocket. "Generously compensated with her own money, from her own company." 3 years, Clara said. The silence in the hallway was absolute. "When she left you for a billionaire, you drank until you couldn't stand. I held you together. I built the quiet house you needed to survive. And the moment she returns, you replace me." Julian looked at her, his expression hardening. He was tired of pretending. He was tired of the guilt. He wanted to be free of the woman who reminded him of his lowest point. "I never hid what this was, Clara," Julian said, his voice dropping to a harsh, clinical whisper. "You were safe. You were quiet. You were what I needed when my life fell apart. But you were never hurt." He stepped closer, towering over her, delivering the final devastating blow with the precision of a surgeon. "I married you to forget her," he said, "and I appreciate what you did. But she is back now, and I cannot pretend anymore." The words hung in the cold, conditioned air of the 50th floor. They did not break Clara. Instead, the remaining warmth in her blood seemed to freeze, solidifying into something sharp and unbreakable. The fragile, devoted wife he had known for 3 years died in that exact second. She did not slap him. She did not beg. Clara slowly withdrew her empty left hand from her side, the diamond wedding band catching the dim light. She looked at the ring, then at the man she had bought and paid for. She breathed in, her spine straightening, the ruined navy silk falling perfectly still around her. The city below, the penthouse, was a blur of neon and freezing rain. Clara bypassed the warmth of the living room, ignoring the soft amber glow of the lamps. She had carefully chosen to make this massive, sterile space feel like a home. She walked directly to the glass terrace doors, pushed them open, and stepped out into the storm. The wind off the balcony was brutal. It whipped the rain sideways, instantly soaking her hair and clinging to the wine-stained navy silk of her dress. She stood near the glass railing, looking out over the endless expanse of the city. The cold was a physical shock, driving the last remnants of numbness from her veins. For 3 years she had lived inside a ghost story. She looked back through the glass into the penthouse. The Persian rugs, the curated bookshelves, the pristine mahogany dining table, where they had eaten dinner together every Sunday. She had built a sanctuary for a man who was only using it as a waiting room. She had poured her hidden wealth into his failing company, convinced that her silent loyalty would eventually earn his love. Instead, it had only earned her the right to be discarded the moment his first choice became available again. A sharp, jagged breath escaped her lips. It was the only sound of grief she allowed herself. The cold rain washed the smudged mascara down her cheeks, washing away the tired, devoted wife who had stood in the 50th floor hallway. The shivering stopped. The erratic beating of her heart slowed to a steady, rhythmic march. Clara turned her back to the city skyline and walked inside. She left the terrace doors open just enough to let the freezing air kill the artificial warmth of the room. Moving to the master suit, she stood before the full-length mirror. She looked at the ruined dress. She reached for the zipper at the back of her neck and pulled it down. The damp navy silk fell to the hardwood floor, pooling around her feet like a discarded skin. She did not put on anything Julian had bought her. She bypassed the designer gowns and the cashmere sweaters he had approved of, reaching instead into the back of the closet for the things she had owned before him: a dark, tailored turtleneck, a pair of sharp black trousers, a heavy wool trench coat. From her jewelry box, she took nothing. She looked down at her left hand. The diamond engagement ring and the matching wedding band felt suddenly heavy, like lead weights designed to keep her anchored to a sinking ship. Clara gripped the platinum bands and slid them off her finger. They left a pale, faint indentation on her skin, the only physical proof she had ever been married. She walked over to Julian's nightstand and placed the rings exactly in the center of the dark wood. Beside them, she set the keys to the penthouse. From the pocket of the ruined navy dress on the floor, she retrieved the vintage silver fountain pen. She wiped a stray drop of rainwater from its barrel, her thumb brushing over the engraved metal. This she kept. She slipped it securely into the inner pocket of her trench coat. She packed one small leather suitcase. Only her personal documents, a basic necessities and the black folder that contained the financial architecture of Thorn Industries, the architecture she owned. She was zipping the suitcase closed when she heard the front door unlock. Julian had not stayed at the gala as late as she expected. He stepped into the foyer, shaking the rain from his umbrella. He smelled faintly of expensive champagne and the unmistakable, heavy floral scent of Elisa's perfume. He stopped in the doorway of the bedroom, leaning against the frame. He looked at the discarded, wine-stained dress on the floor, the open closet, and finally, the small leather suitcase standing at Clara's feet. He let out a long, theatrical sigh. It was the sigh of a man attempting to manage an unreasonable employee. "I told you I would have my driver take you to a hotel tomorrow," Julian said, loosening his silk tie. "There is no need for this midnight melodrama, Clara. The weather is terrible. You are acting out of spite." Clara stood up. She picked up the handle of the suitcase. "I am leaving," she said. Her voice was unrecognizable. It carried no warmth, no bitterness, no tears. It was an expensive, empty stillness. Julian frowned. He pushed off the doorframe, walking further into the room. He noticed the rings sitting on his nightstand, and his frown deepened into a scowl of irritation. "Look, I know you are hurt," he said, using the placating tone he reserved for difficult board members. "But let us be adults about this. I will make sure my lawyers draft a very generous settlement first thing in the morning. You will have the house in the Hamptons. You will have a substantial allowance. You will never have to work a day in your life. I am not throwing you out on the street." He actually believed it. He genuinely believed his wealth was protecting her, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire empire was currently financed by the woman standing in front of him. Clara looked at him. She looked at his handsome face, the arrogant slope of his jaw, the gold pocket watch resting against his vest. She searched herself for the familiar ache of heartbreak, for the desperate need to change his mind. There was nothing, only a clean, absolute void. "You don't need your lawyers to draft anything, Julian," Clara said quietly. Julian stopped pacing. He looked at her, his brows knitting together, for the first time since he had stepped off the elevator on the 50th floor. He seemed to actually see her, not the quiet, accommodating wife. Someone else, someone standing entirely out of his reach. "What does that mean?" he asked. Clara walked past him. She moved with a measured, controlled grace, her dark trench coat sweeping past his charcoal suit. She stopped at the bedroom door, not turning around to face him. "You said you married me to forget her." Clara said, her voice drifting back to him in the quiet room. "Clara, then remember this goodbye," she replied. She walked down the hallway. She did not rush. She did not slam the front door. She simply pulled it open and let it click shut behind her with a soft, definitive sound. Julian stood alone in the master suite. The freezing wind from the open terrace doors blew through the room, making him shiver. He looked at the pale rings on the nightstand and the crumpled, stained dress on the floor. A sudden, inexplicable sense of dread settled in the pit of his stomach, cold and heavy. He brushed it off. He was Julian Thorn. He had his company back on top, and he had Elise. He had everything he wanted. He had no idea that the woman who had just walked out the door had taken the foundation of his entire world with her. The gold pocket watch resting on the mahogany table ticked with a rhythmic, maddening precision. 1 year. It had been exactly 12 months since Clara walked out of the penthouse. In the beginning, Julian Thorn had barely noticed her absence. He had Elise. He had his public image. He had the arrogant assumption that Thorn Industries was invincible because he was at the helm. He was wrong. Now, the 50th floor boardroom felt less like a seat of power and more like a slowly shrinking cage. Julian stood at the head of the massive table, his knuckles pressed hard against the polished wood. The bespoke charcoal suit hung slightly looser on his frame. The dark circles under his deep set gray eyes betrayed weeks of sleepless nights. On the massive digital screen behind him, a single, terrifying financial chart glowed in relentless red lines. "They bought another 4% this morning," his chief financial officer said, his voice tight with panic. "That brings their total control to 51% of the voting shares, combined with the original debt they hold. Julian, we have lost the majority. We do not even know who we are fighting." Julian stared at the screen, a cold sweat breaking out at the base of his neck. For the past 6 months, an anonymous entity known only as Vanguard Holdings had been ruthlessly, methodically swallowing his company. They did not make public statements. They did not demand board seats. They simply bought every piece of available debt, quietly cornering him until he was entirely paralyzed. "It makes no sense," Julian muttered, pacing the length of the room. "The original silent investor who saved us 3 years ago. They were passive. They just held the debt. Why are they suddenly weaponizing it now? Because sharks smell blood, Elise Montgomery said. She sat elegantly in one of the high-backed leather chairs, her legs crossed. She wore a tailored crimson dress, the diamond tennis bracelet catching the overhead lights. She looked entirely unbothered by the panic suffocating the room. In fact, she looked like a woman who was precisely where she wanted to be. Julian stopped pacing and looked at her. Elise, this is not a game. If Vanguard calls in the debt tomorrow, Thorn Industries is bankrupt by noon. Elise offered a soft, sympathetic sigh. She stood up, walking over to him. She placed her manicured hands flat against the lapels of his suit, looking up at him with wide, assuring eyes. Julian, look at me, she whispered, her voice dropping to that intimate, sugary cadence she used to disarm him. I am not going to let you fall. I told you I came back to build a life with you. Montgomery Holdings is cash rich. We can execute a full corporate merger. My company absorbs your toxic debt, your assets are shielded, and we dilute Vanguard's voting power in the process. Julian hesitated. A merger meant giving up half his autonomy to Elise's family trust. It was a massive concession, but looking into her pristine, porcelain face, he saw his only lifeline. You would do that for me? He asked, his voice thick with desperate relief. I married you in my heart a long time ago. Elise lied beautifully. We just need to finalize the merger agreement today. But there is one hurdle. According to your bylaws, a merger of this scale requires the physical signature of the majority shareholder. Vanguard. Have your lawyers contacted them? Julian asked, turning to his CFO. Yes, the CFO swallowed hard. We received a response an hour ago. The legal representative of Vanguard Holdings is willing to sign off on the merger. They are sending their principal owner to the building at 3 o'clock today to execute the documents in person. Julian let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 6 months. A wave of triumphant energy washed over him. The crisis was averted. Elise had saved him. The anonymous owner was actually going to fold. Prepare the boardroom. Julian commanded, his arrogant posture returning. Set up the press conference in the lobby for 4 o'clock. We are going to show the market that Thorn Industries is untouchable. Elise smiled, a sharp, predatory curve of her red lips. She had finally secured the throne. 10 miles away, high above the chaotic noise of the financial district, the air in the private office of Vanguard Holdings was perfectly, expensively still. There were no red charts on these walls. There was no panic. Clara stood by the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the sprawling city. The rain from a year ago was a distant memory. Today, the sunlight poured through the glass, wrapping her in a brilliant, cold illumination. She was unrecognizable. The tired, fragile woman in the wrinkled navy dress had been buried and forgotten. In her place stood a woman forged from absolute pressure. Clara wore a flawlessly tailored ivory power suit, the sharp lines of the jacket accentuating a spine that refused to bend for anyone. Her dark brown hair, once pulled back in a messy, accommodating bun, was now styled in a sleek, immaculate twist. She wore no jewelry. She did not need diamonds to command a room. The trap is set, Miss Vance, a calm voice said from the doorway. Clara turned. Arthur, her lead corporate attorney, stood holding a sleek black leather folder. He stepped into the room and placed it on her polished glass desk. Julian has accepted the merger proposal with Montgomery Holdings, Arthur continued, opening the folder. He believes Elise is saving him from us. He has no idea that Montgomery Holdings has been secretly leveraged for 2 years. If he merges with her, he attaches his remaining healthy assets to a sinking ship. Clara walked slowly toward the desk. Her heels made a sharp, definitive clicking sound against the marble floor. Elise is a parasite, Clara said, her voice smooth and devoid of any emotional tremor. She always looks for a strong host to carry her weight. Julian was too blinded by his own ego to look into her financials. He only sees what flatters him. She reached out and rested her hand on the black folder. And the Vanguard shares? Clara asked. You hold 60% of the voting power now. Arthur confirmed, handing her a document. You own the building he is standing in. You own the chairs in his boardroom. You own the debt he cannot pay. And at 3 o'clock, he is expecting the owner of Vanguard to walk through his doors and sign it all away to him and his mistress. Clara looked down at the preliminary authorization form. From the inner pocket of her ivory jacket, she withdrew a vintage silver fountain pen. The metal was cool against her skin. It was the same pen she had gripped in the shadows of the Fiftieth floor hallway while Julian broke her heart. She uncapped it. The nib touched the heavy paper, the ink flowing in sharp, angular strokes as she signed her name. Not Mrs. Julian Thorn, Clara Vance. She capped the pen with a soft, final click. She did not feel the bitter sting of betrayal anymore. The wound had healed into something much stronger. It had healed into armor. Call the driver, Arthur. Clara said, sliding the silver pen back into her pocket. She picked up the black folder, her hazel eyes completely cold. It is time Julian meets his savior. The 50th floor boardroom of Thorn Industries was designed to intimidate. A massive slab of polished mahogany stretched across the center of the room, surrounded by 20 high-backed leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the financial district, making anyone who stood at the glass feel like a god looking down on an empire. Today, that empire was held together by a single stack of paper. At exactly 2:45 in the afternoon, the room was thick with the suffocating tension of high-stakes corporate survival. Half a dozen lawyers in immaculate suits moved quietly around the table, arranging the merger documents. The Montgomery-Thorn consolidation. It was a brutal legal marriage, one that would bind Julian's assets inextricably to Elise's family trust. Julian Thorn stood at the head of the table. He adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal suit, his fingers grazing the cold gold of his pocket watch. He was trying to project the aura of a conqueror, but his jaw was locked in tight, anxious lines. "Stop pacing, Julian. You are making the attorneys nervous," Elise said. She sat at his right hand, the seat reserved for the second in command. She looked entirely at ease, leaning back in the heavy leather chair. Her crimson dress struck a sharp, bloody contrast against the dark wood of the room. She was sipping sparkling water from a crystal glass, watching the frantic preparations with the amused detachment of a queen watching her servants toil. "I am not pacing," Julian lied, resting his hands on the back of his chair. "I just want this finalized. Vanguard has been a thorn in my side for 6 months. I want to see the face of the man who thought he could corner me right before he signs his leverage away." Elise offered a dismissive little laugh. She reached out, running a manicured fingernail along the edge of the mahogany table. "You give this anonymous investor too much credit," Elise said. "He is just a corporate vulture. He bought your debt thinking you were weak. Now that he sees Montgomery Holdings stepping in to back you, he is taking the exit strategy. It's simple math, Julian. They cannot fight old money." David, the chief financial officer of Thorn Industries, stood near the projector screen. He was sweating, despite the icy temperature of the climate-controlled room. He clutched a thick financial dossier to his chest. "With all due respect, Ms. Montgomery," David interjected, his voice wavering slightly, "Vanguard Holdings does not operate like a vulture fund. Vultures make noise. They demand public restructuring. Vanguard has been completely silent. They absorbed 51% of our voting power without issuing a single press release. That isn't math. That is an execution." Elise's icy blue eyes snapped toward the CFO. The amused smile vanished from her lips, replaced by a look of sheer aristocratic disdain. "You are easily frightened, David," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "Perhaps that is why Julian's company fell into this mess in the first place. You lack vision. When this merger is complete, I will be conducting a thorough review of the executive team. I suggest you focus on organizing the signature pages." David flushed a deep, humiliated red and looked down at his shoes. Julian did not defend him. Julian simply watched Elise, captivated by her ruthlessness. This was what he had been missing for 3 years. A woman who fought like a shark, an equal, he thought briefly of Clara. It was a fleeting, uncomfortable memory. He remembered the quiet, sterile way she had walked out of the penthouse exactly a year ago. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't fought for her territory. She had simply packed one small suitcase and vanished into the rain. He had sent his lawyers after her, offering a multi-million-dollar settlement, the house in the Hamptons, a generous allowance to soothe his own guilt. The lawyers had returned a week later, bewildered. The bank accounts he set up for her remained untouched. The deed to the Hamptons house had been mailed back to his office, torn neatly in half. He had assumed she was too weak, too overwhelmed by her broken heart to even process the divorce properly. He assumed she had retreated to some quiet, middle-class existence, fading into the background where she belonged. Julian. Elise's voice pulled him back to the present. She was looking around the boardroom, her delicate nose wrinkled in faint distaste. "Once the ink is dry, we are redesigning this floor. The aesthetic is entirely too domestic. The muted curtains, these awful vintage lamps in the corner. It feels like a suburban library. We need modern art, steel, glass, something that actually projects power." Julian looked at the vintage brass lamps in the corner. Clara had picked them out. She had spent a month sourcing them from an antique dealer in London, telling him they would bring warmth to the cold corporate space. "Consider it done," Julian said, his voice flat. "Get the whole floor tomorrow." Elise smiled, satisfied. She reached across the table placing her hand over his. Her diamond tennis bracelet clinked against his gold watch. "We are going to rule this city, Julian. Today is just the beginning." "Yes." Julian agreed, his chest swelling with returning arrogance. The panic of the morning was fading. He was Julian Thorne. He was untouchable. At exactly 2:58, the sleek black phone in the center of the mahogany table lit up with a silent, flashing red light. The private line from the ground floor reception. The low hum of conversation among the lawyers instantly died. The room went dead silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Julian pressed the speaker button. "Yes," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Thorne." The head receptionist's voice trembled slightly through the speaker. It was highly unusual. The receptionist was a veteran who never lost her composure. "The representative for Vanguard Holdings has just walked through the lobby doors." Julian shared a triumphant look with Elise. The trap was springing. "Excellent," Julian said smoothly. "Have security escort him to the private elevator. Bring him directly to the 50th floor." There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. The static hissed softly in the quiet boardroom. "Sir," the receptionist said, her voice dropping to a confused, hushed whisper. "It isn't him." And she bypassed security, sir. Her security detail just locked down the front desk. "She is already in the private elevator." Julian frowned, a sudden, cold prickle of unease running down his spine. "She." Before the receptionist could answer, the digital display above the boardroom's double doors chimed softly. The private elevator had begun its ascent. 40, 40, 40. Elise adjusted her posture, narrowing her eyes at the doors. Julian stood taller, buttoning his charcoal jacket. They were ready to crush whoever stepped off that elevator. They were ready for a corporate rival. They were not ready for a ghost. The private elevator of Thorne Industries was a silent, ascending glass capsule. As it shot upward through the steel and glass spine of the corporate tower, Clara Vance stood perfectly still in the center of the car. There was no elevator music. There was only the faint, aerodynamic hum of modern engineering pushing her closer to the 50th floor. She looked at her reflection in the polished mirrored doors. A year ago, the woman staring back at her would have been slouching slightly, shrinking her posture to take up as little space as possible. She would have been wearing a practical, forgettable color. She would have been rehearsing apologies in her head for things that were not her fault. That woman was gone. The reflection in the glass was sharp, immaculate, and entirely devoid of hesitation. The tailored ivory power suit fell in flawless, architectural lines. Her spine was straight, pulling her to her full, commanding height. Her dark brown hair, pinned into a severe, elegant twist, left her pale face entirely exposed. There was no heavy makeup to hide behind, no diamonds to distract the eye. She did not need armor made of jewels. Her composure was her armor. Beside her, Arthur, her lead corporate attorney, stood holding the black leather folder. He watched the digital floor indicator climb. "Julian has no idea," Arthur said quietly, breaking the silence of the elevator. "He thinks Vanguard is a faceless hedge fund from Europe. He thinks Elise is his white knight." Clara did not look away from the mirror. "Julian has always been blind to the things that do not make noise," she replied. She slid her hand into the pocket of her ivory jacket, her fingers finding the familiar, cool weight of the vintage silver fountain pen. She gripped it gently, feeling the engraved grooves along the barrel. The touch of the metal pulled her backward in time. 3 years ago, it had been a Tuesday in November. A bitter freezing rain had been washing over the city. Julian had been sitting on the floor of his old office, surrounded by past due notices and foreclosure threats. Elise had just left him for a European billionaire, and the press had torn his company to shreds. He had been drinking whiskey, straight from the bottle, his eyes hollow, his arrogance entirely shattered. He had wept that night, not for the company, but for Elise. Clara had watched him from the doorway, her heart aching with a naive, desperate kind of love. She had believed that if she could just fix his world, if she could rebuild his foundation, he would eventually look at her and see her worth. The next morning, while Julian was passed out on the sofa, Clara had walked into Arthur's sterile law office. She had placed a worn, leather-bound document on his desk, the deed to her late mother's massive, hidden trust fund. It was generational wealth, quietly accumulated and entirely disconnected from the Thorne name. Liquidated. Clara had told Arthur 3 years ago, her voice trembling slightly but her resolve absolute. All of it. Set up a blind LC. Call it Vanguard Holdings. Buy his toxic debt, pay off the creditors, and inject enough capital to keep the doors open, but retain the voting rights as collateral. Arthur had looked at her, stunned by the sheer magnitude of the financial sacrifice. Messrs. Thorne, if you do this, You are handing over your entire safety net to a sinking ship. Does your husband know? No, she had answered, and he cannot know. He is a proud man. If he knows his new wife bailed him out with her mother's money, it will break his pride. Let him think a silent investor believes in his vision. I just want him to heal. Arthur had handed her a document that finalized the transfer. Clara had reached into her purse and pulled out a vintage silver fountain pen. A graduation gift from her mother. She had signed her wealth away in smooth blue, inked strokes, trading her security for a ghost of a chance at love. She had bought his empire. And 3 years later, in a glass hallway, he had told her he only married her to forget the woman who broke him. 48, 49, 50. The digital chime of the elevator brought Clara back to the present. Her fingers released the silver pen in her pocket. The memory did not bring pain anymore. It only brought a cold, clarifying focus. The debt of love had been cancelled. Only the financial debt remained. The mirror door slid open with a soft hiss. The 50th floor executive reception area was a sprawling, open-concept space of white marble and minimalist modern art. 6 executive assistants sat behind curved desks. 2 imposing security guards stood near the entrance of the boardroom hallway. When Clara stepped out of the elevator, the reception area froze. The head assistant, a woman named Sarah, who used to offer Clara pitying, condescending smiles when she brought Julian his lunch, stood up so fast her knee slammed into her desk. The loud thud echoed in the sudden silence. Mrs. Thorne. Sarah gasped, her eyes wide, entirely disoriented by the vision before her. Clara did not stop walking. "It is Miss Vance," she corrected, her voice carrying a quiet, terrifying authority. "And you do not need to announce me." The security guards moved instinctively to block the hallway, their hands raising. They had strict orders. No one entered without Julian's explicit permission. But as Clara kept walking, her gaze met the lead guard's eyes. There was an absolute, freezing dominance in her hazel eyes, a look that said she owned the floor he was standing on. Arthur stepped slightly forward, holding up a platinum access card with the Vanguard Holdings insignia. The guards hesitated, looking from the card to Clara's face. In that split second of indecision, they parted. Clara walked straight down the corridor, her heels striking the polished marble floor like the ticking of a metronome. Click, click, click. The sound was sharp, rhythmic, and impossible to ignore. Behind her, the assistants stared in stunned, breathless silence, watching the woman they used to mock glide through the executive suit like an avenging sovereign. At the end of the hallway stood the heavy, double oak doors of the boardroom. Clara stopped exactly 1 foot away from the wood. She could hear the faint, muffled sound of Julian's voice inside, arrogant and oblivious. She could imagine Elise sitting beside him, adjusting her diamond bracelet, waiting to claim an empire she had not bled for. Clara did not raise her hand to knock. She did not seek permission to enter her own property. She looked at Arthur. He stepped forward, grabbed both brass handles, and pushed the heavy oak doors wide open. The silence she was about to deliver would be the most expensive thing in the room. The heavy oak doors swung inward. The brass hinges did not make a sound, but the sudden shift in air pressure felt like a physical strike inside the climate-controlled room. 20 faces turned toward the entrance. A dozen high-priced corporate lawyers, the chief financial officer, Elise Montgomery in her striking crimson dress, and Julian Thorne standing at the head of the mahogany table. They were perfectly primed to grovel. They had arranged their faces into expressions of deep, respectful submission, fully expecting an aging European billionaire or a ruthless hedge fund titan to step through the frame. Instead, Clara Vance walked in. For 3 long seconds, the boardroom of Thorne Industries ceased to function. The ticking of Julian's gold pocket watch seemed to echo violently against the glass walls. No one breathed. No one moved. The collective shock paralyzed the room so completely that even the seasoned attorneys forgot how to speak. Clara stood in the doorway, framed by the bright light of the executive corridor. The ivory power suit armored her in sharp, unyielding lines. Her dark hair was pulled tight, her hazel eyes completely devoid of the soft, accommodating warmth Julian had exploited for 3 years. She looked like a blade that had finally been unsheathed. Julian's brain misfired. His arrogance, built on a foundation of absolute narcissism, instantly shielded him from the truth. He did not see Vanguard Holdings. He saw the discarded, humiliated wife he had left in the rain a year ago, showing up to beg for scraps. His shock mutated rapidly into a hot, blinding embarrassment. "Clara!" Julian barked, the sound cracking like a whip across the silent room. He dropped his hands from the back of his chair, his face flushing dark red. "What the hell are you doing here?" Elise leaned back in her leather chair, recovering her composure faster than Julian. She let out a soft, theatrical sigh, resting her chin on her hand, the diamonds on her wrist catching the light. Security really has become entirely useless, Julian. Elise drawled, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. She looked Clara up and down, taking in the tailored suit, but entirely missing the lethal authority behind it. Are you lost, darling? Or did you just run out of alimony money? This is a private corporate acquisition, not a divorce counseling session. Clara did not flinch. She did not raise her voice to match Julian's anger or Elise's mockery. She simply began to walk. Her heels clicked sharply against the dark hardwood floor, cutting through the heavy silence. She walked straight past the junior lawyers, who instinctively pulled their chairs closer to the table to get out of her way. She ignored Elise completely, fixing her cold, steady gaze entirely on Julian. Get out, Julian commanded, his voice rising in volume, the panic of the pending Vanguard arrival making him reckless. He pointed a shaking finger at the open doors. You have exactly 10 seconds to leave this room before I have you physically dragged out by security. You are humiliating yourself, Clara. I offered you a settlement. If you are here to stage some pathetic public scene to extort more money from me, you picked the wrong day. Clara reached the center of the massive mahogany table. She stopped. Arthur, her attorney, stepped up beside her. He placed the heavy black leather folder gently onto the polished wood. I did not come for your money, Julian, Clara said. Her voice was not loud, but the acoustic perfection of the boardroom carried every syllable with terrifying clarity. It was the voice of a woman who owned the walls around them. I came for mine. Julian let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. He looked at Arthur, recognizing the man as a high-powered attorney, but failing to connect the dots. David. Julian snapped, turning to his sweating CFO. Call down to the lobby. Vanguard's representative is supposed to be here. Delay them. Tell them there has been a minor security breach. Then get this crazy woman out of my building. David, the CFO, had gone entirely pale. He was looking at the black folder on the table. He was looking at the platinum access badge clipped to Arthur's lapel, the badge that bore the distinct interlocking V insignia of Vanguard Holdings. David swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. Julian, he whispered, his voice trembling. Julian, look at the badge. Julian frowned, turning his head back toward Clara and her attorney. Arthur calmly opened the black leather folder. He arranged the documents facing Julian. At the top of the stack was the merger agreement Julian had spent weeks drafting. Next to was a proof of ownership document, stamped with a red corporate seal. Thorne, Arthur said smoothly, his tone strictly professional, betraying none of the absolute destruction he was about to unleash. There is no security breach, and there will be no delay. Vanguard's representative arrived exactly on time. Arthur stepped back, gesturing formally to the woman standing beside him in the ivory suit. Gentlemen, Ms. Montgomery. Arthur continued, his voice echoing in the dead silence. Allow me to introduce the founder, principal investor, and sole proprietor of Vanguard Holdings, Miss Clara Vance. The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Julian stopped breathing. The color drained from his face so fast he looked as though he had been physically struck. His eyes darted wildly from Arthur's face to the Vanguard documents on the table, and finally to Clara. That is impossible. Julian stammered, his arrogant posture collapsing. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table just to keep himself standing. Vanguard saved this company 3 years ago. Vanguard holds $80 million in leveraged debt. You were making my coffee. You had nothing. I had my mother's estate, Clara corrected softly. She reached into the inner pocket of her ivory jacket and withdrew the vintage silver fountain pen. She laid it gently on top of the Vanguard ownership documents. The metal clinked softly against the dark wood. Julian stared at the pen. He recognized it. It was the pen she always carried. The pen she had held in the glass hallway the night he told her she was merely a placeholder. 3 years ago, I liquidated my entire maternal inheritance to buy your toxic debt and keep your doors open, Clara said, her hazel eyes locked onto his, freezing him in place. I hid my name behind an LLC because I wanted to protect your fragile ego. I built the floor you are standing on, Julian, and you threw me out of my own house. Elise shot up from her chair, her crimson dress catching against the wood. Julian, she's lying. This is a trick. It has to be a trick. Clara slowly turned her head to look at Elise. The silence that followed was absolute, cold, and entirely merciless. Sit down, Elise, Clara whispered. The owner of the company is speaking. Elise Montgomery did not sit down immediately. She stood frozen in her crimson dress, her ice blue eyes darting frantically toward the high-priced corporate lawyers surrounding the mahogany table. She expected them to intervene. She expected them to defend Julian's empire, to object, to throw this delusional woman out. But the lawyers were not looking at Julian, and they were certainly not looking at Elise. They were looking at the Vanguard Holdings ownership documents lying beneath the vintage silver fountain pen. They were men paid to recognize power, and they understood instantly that the power in the room had shifted permanently. Slowly, as if choreographed, the legal team took a collective half-step backward, physically distancing themselves from Julian Thorne. Julian, Elise demanded, her voice losing its sugary polish, cracking with genuine panic. Do something. Julian stood like a man who had just been told the earth was hollow. He looked at Clara, standing immaculate in her ivory suit, and tried to reconcile her with the quiet, accommodating woman who used to iron his shirts and brew his midnight tea. He could not do it. This is illegal. Julian stammered, his voice weak. He gripped the edge of the table. You are my wife. Any assets you held during the marriage are subject to division. I will take you to court. I will freeze Vanguard entirely. Arthur, standing calmly at Clara's side, adjusted his glasses. The capital used to fund Vanguard Holdings was derived from a blind trust established by Miss Vance's late mother, long before your marriage. Under the terms of the trust and the prenuptial agreement you yourself insisted she signed 3 years ago, those assets are entirely immune to marital division. You have no legal claim to her money, mixed Thorne. You only have the debt you owe her. The prenuptial agreement. Julian felt a sickening drop in his stomach. He had demanded that agreement to protect his company from her, believing she was just a middle-class woman seeking security. He had effectively locked himself out of her massive, hidden fortune. No, Julian whispered, shaking his head. He looked desperately at Elise. He reached out and grabbed her hand, the diamonds on her tennis bracelet pressing into his palm. No, it doesn't matter. We don't need Vanguard. We have Montgomery Holdings. We will execute the merger right now, bypass the Vanguard debt, and dilute your voting shares into irrelevance. He looked at Clara with a sudden, wild defiance, clinging to the only lifeline he had left. You thought you could walk in here and ruin me. Elise's family is backing me. Montgomery Holdings is cash rich. We are merging. You lose, Clara. Clara did not look angry. She did not look threatened. She looked at Julian with a profound, chilling pity. It was the exact same look he had given her in the glass hallway a year ago when he told her to pack her bags. A merger, Clara said. Softly, the word echoing in the absolute silence of the room. A faint, humorless smile touched the corners of her mouth. She did not look at Julian. She turned her hazel eyes slowly toward Elise. Elise flinched. The color rapidly drained from her flawless porcelain face. Clara gestured slightly with her hand. Arthur reached into the black leather folder and pulled out a second stack of documents, much thinner than the first. He slid them across the polished mahogany table directly toward David, the sweating chief financial officer. You always were blinded by a pretty face and an old name, Julian, Clara said, her voice smooth and analytical, cutting through his arrogance like a scalpel. You were so eager to have your true inspiration back that you didn't even run a proper independent audit of her company, did you? You let her lawyers provide the financial disclosures. Julian frowned, his hand slowly releasing Elise's. What are you talking about? Read the file, David? Clara commanded gently. David, his hands shaking visibly, opened the thin stack of papers. He scanned the first page, then the second. His breath hitched in his throat. He looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Julian, David whispered. He pushed the file across the table toward his boss. Julian, these are SEC audit leaks, verified banking records from the Cayman Islands. What does it say? Julian demanded, a new kind of dread settling over him. Montgomery Holdings hasn't been cash-rich in a decade, David said, his voice breaking. They are leveraged to the hilt. They have 3 massive defaults pending next month. Julian, they are drowning. Elise didn't come here to save us with a merger. She came to attach her toxic debt to our remaining healthy assets. If you sign that paper today, her creditors will seize Thorne Industries by Friday. The words struck the room like a physical explosion. Julian stared at the documents, the columns of red numbers confirming the absolute ruin he had almost invited into his life. He looked up at Elise. Elise was no longer the poised, aristocratic queen of the boardroom. She looked cornered, her eyes wild, her chest heaving under the crimson silk. Julian, she faked those! Elise shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at Clara. She is a vindictive, jealous liar! She is trying to tear us apart because you chose me over her! The records are certified. Miss Montgomery, Arthur stated coldly, tapping the red seal on the documents. Fraud on this level carries a federal prison sentence. Shall we call the authorities to verify them? Eliza's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She stumbled backward, bumping into her heavy leather chair, her entire glamorous facade shattering into a million pathetic pieces. Julian felt the floor give way beneath him. The reality of his existence crashed down with devastating clarity. For a year, he had believed Elise was his savior, the brilliant, wealthy woman who had returned to build an empire with him. In truth, she was a parasite, a sinking ship desperately trying to use him as a life raft to survive. She had not come back for love. She had come back because she was broke. And Clara. Julian turned his head slowly, looking at the woman in the ivory suit standing at the center of the room, the woman he had mocked, the woman he had hidden in the shadows, the woman he had discarded like trash because she wasn't enough for his grand vision. She had been the one holding up the sky the entire time. She had bought his debts, paid his creditors, and suffered in silence while he paraded his ego around the city. And when he broke her heart, she had not cried. She had simply taken her sky away. Clara, Julian whispered, his voice entirely broken. The arrogance was gone. The polished CEO was dead. Only a hollow, terrified man remained. Clara looked at him, her expression perfectly composed, the vintage silver pen resting on the table between them like a drawn sword. You said you married me to forget her, Julian? Clara said, her voice dropping to a quiet, devastating murmur that only he could fully feel. How does it feel to remember? The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of an empire being dismantled brick by brick. Julian Thorne could not form a single word in response to Clara's question. His throat worked, but his vocal cords had paralyzed. He stared at the vintage silver pen resting on the mahogany table, the physical manifestation of the $80 million she had quietly bled to save him while he had treated her like an inconvenience. Clara did not wait for his answer. She did not need it. She turned her attention away from Julian, dismissing him entirely, and looked at the row of pale, stunned corporate lawyers. Arthur. Clara said, her voice perfectly level, slicing through the stagnant air. Please distribute the formal notices. Arthur opened the final compartment of his black leather folder. He began sliding thick, legally binding envelopes across the table to the senior partners and to David, the chief financial officer. As the proprietor of Vanguard Holdings, representing 60% of the voting shares, I am formally vetoing the Montgomery consolidation. Clara announced. Her hazel eyes swept the room. The merger is dead. Any further attempt to attach Thorne Industries' assets to the Montgomery Family Trust will be treated as hostile financial sabotage, and I will personally litigate against every attorney who signs their name to it. The lead lawyer swallowed hard and immediately closed his copy of the merger agreement, pushing it away as if it had suddenly caught fire. Elise let out a sharp, breathless sound. She grabbed Julian's arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the charcoal fabric of his suit. Julian, Elise pleaded, her voice high and desperate. Julian, you cannot let her do this! We have an agreement! My family. Your family is bankrupt, Elise. Julian cut her off. His voice was hollow, scraping out of his chest like crushed glass. He looked down at the woman he had obsessed over for 5 years, the woman he had destroyed his marriage for, without the illusion of her wealth, without the glossy veneer of her untouchable social status. She looked remarkably small. She looked exactly like what Clara had called her, a parasite. He ripped his arm out of her grasp with a visceral shudder of disgust. Get away from me, Julian said, stepping back from her as if she were carrying a plague. Elise's face twisted in fury and humiliation. You fool, she hissed, her aristocratic mask entirely abandoned. You were nothing before I gave you my time! You are a pathetic, arrogant man who cannot even keep his own company afloat without hiding behind a woman's skirt. First hers and then mine. Security, Clara said quietly. The two guards who had been standing uncertainly by the boardroom doors immediately stepped forward. They no longer looked to Julian for orders. The chain of command had been permanently severed. Montgomery's business here is concluded, Clara instructed, her gaze fixed neutrally on the far wall, not even granting Elise the dignity of eye contact. Please escort her to the lobby. Ensure she does not take any Thorne Industries property on her way out. Do not touch me, Elise shrieked as the guards approached. She snatched her designer handbag from the table her crimson dress sweeping wildly around her. She shot one last, venomous glare at Julian, then at Clara. But Clara remained an immovable statue of ivory and ice. Elise spun on her heels and stormed out of the boardroom, the guards shadowing her every step. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind her, sealing her out of Julian's life forever. Julian watched the doors close, his chest heaved. The reality of his situation was settling into his bones, heavy and cold. He turned slowly back to Clara. Clara. Julian began, his voice dropping to a raw, pleading whisper. He took a hesitant step toward her. The arrogance that had defined him for years had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, desperate man. Clara, please. I was blind. I was so incredibly stupid. You saved me. You sacrificed everything for me, and I was too sick with the past to see the incredible woman standing right in front of me. Clara stood perfectly still. She let him speak. She let him expose the full, pathetic depths of his regret in front of his remaining executive team. What can fix this? Julian begged, his hands trembling as he reached out, hovering inches from the sleeve of her ivory suit, but not daring to touch her. You own the company. I accept that. I will step down. I will do whatever you want. Just give me a chance to make it right. Give me a chance to be the husband you actually deserved. I see you now, Clara. I swear to God I see you. You do not see me, Julian, Clara replied. Her voice was not angry. It was a terrifying, absolute calm. It was the sound of a woman looking at a stranger. You see the woman holding your debt? Clara continued, her hazel eyes locking onto his with surgical precision. You see the vault that holds the keys to your survival. If Montgomery Holdings had truly been cash rich, you would have signed that merger today. You would have toasted to your new life, and you never would have thought of me again. Julian flinched as if she had struck him across the face. He opened his mouth to deny it, to swear that he loved her, but the lie died in his throat under the weight of her stare. I did not come here to win you back, Clara said, picking up the silver fountain pen from the mahogany table and slipping it into her jacket pocket. I came here to protect my investment. She turned to David, the CFO, who was still clutching the financial files like a shield. David, effective immediately. Julian Thorne is removed as chief executive officer of this company, citing gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty for failing to vet a fraudulent corporate merger. Clara stated. Julian's knees buckled. He grabbed the back of the heavy leather chair, his knuckles white, staring at her in absolute horror. No, this is my life. This is my company. You cannot take my name off the door. I bought the door 3 years ago. Clara reminded him gently, and you told me to pack my bags. I am simply returning the favor. She looked at the broken man clutching the chair. There was no joy in her chest. There was no sadistic pleasure. There was only a profound, liberating peace. The ghost of the devoted, humiliated wife had finally been laid to rest. Clear out your office, Julian, Clara said, delivering her final verdict. You have 1 hour. Clara Vance did not wait to watch Julian Thorne pack his desk. She had seen enough of his fragility. She turned her back on the shattered man standing at the head of the mahogany table, signaling to Arthur with a brief, subtle nod. The lead attorney immediately began instructing the remaining legal team on the transition protocols, his voice sharp and businesslike, treating Julian not as a CEO, but as an evicted tenant. Clara walked out of the double oak doors. She stepped into the 50th floor executive corridor, the heavy doors closing behind her with a soft, muffled click that severed her from her past forever. The executive assistants, who had been eavesdropping in terrified silence, instantly lowered their eyes as she passed. There were no pitying glances anymore. There was only absolute, breathless respect. She walked to the private elevator. The mirrored doors slid open, welcoming her. As the glass capsule began its rapid descent, Clara let out a long, quiet exhale. The tension that had held her spine perfectly rigid for the last hour slowly dissolved, replaced by a profound, weightless clarity. She looked at her reflection in the glass. The ivory suit remained immaculate. Her dark hair was perfect. She slipped her hand into her pocket, her fingertips grazing the cool metal of the vintage silver fountain pen. She had used it to sign away her fortune for a man who did not love her. Today, she had used it to buy her own freedom. The pen had finally balanced its ledger. The digital numbers above the door counted down. 10, 5, 1. The elevator chimed, and the doors glided open to the sprawling, sunlit expanse of the ground floor lobby. It was packed. Julian had been so fiercely confident in his victory that he had invited the financial press. Dozens of reporters, photographers, and industry analysts were gathered near the security turnstiles, waiting for the triumphant CEO and his glamorous new partner to descend and announce the Montgomery merger. When the private elevator doors opened, the crowd fell silent, expecting Julian. Instead, a lone woman in a striking ivory power suit stepped out. The press corps murmured in confusion. A few veteran financial reporters recognized her, not as the Phantom Vanguard investor, but as Clara Thorne, the quiet, discarded wife from a year ago. Whispers began to ripple through the marble lobby like a rising tide. Clara ignored them. She bypassed the velvet ropes and the flashing cameras, her heels clicking steadily against the polished stone, moving directly toward the revolving glass doors that led out into the bustling city street. "Clara! Wait!" The voice echoed wildly from the far side of the lobby, shattering the professional murmur of the crowd. Clara stopped. She did not turn around immediately. From a standard employee elevator, Julian burst into the lobby. The arrogant, polished executive who had stood in the boardroom 20 minutes ago was gone. His bespoke charcoal suit was rumpled, his silk tie was pulled loose, and the gold pocket watch swung erratically from his vest. He was pale, sweating, and sprinting across the marble floor with the frantic, uncoordinated desperation of a drowning man. The reporters immediately raised their cameras. The rapid fire click of shutters and the blinding burst of flashbulbs erupted across the room. Julian did not care about the cameras. He did not care about his public image. He crashed through the velvet ropes, stopping just a few feet behind Clara, his chest heaving as he fought for breath. "Clara, please," Julian gasped, his voice carrying the raw, pathetic pitch of total defeat. "You cannot leave it like this. You cannot just take everything and walk out. I built this company. My name is on the building." Clara turned slowly. The flashing lights of the press illuminated her face, catching the cold, untouchable elegance of her posture. She looked at the man she had once loved so deeply that it felt like an illness. She looked at the frantic, disheveled stranger begging for his empire in front of 50 reporters. "Your name is on the building, Julian," Clara said, her voice calm and remarkably clear, carrying effortlessly over the ambient noise of the lobby. "But my signature is on the deed." "I was wrong," Julian cried out, stepping closer, his hands held out in a gesture of absolute surrender. The cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every second of his humiliation. "I was a fool. I let my ego blind me. But you loved me once. You stayed with me when I had nothing. Please, Clara, don't leave me with nothing again." Clara's hazel eyes remained entirely unmoved. She did not raise her voice. She did not gloat. The expensive silence of her demeanor was 1,000 times more devastating than any screaming match could ever be. "I am not leaving you with nothing," Clara replied softly. "I am leaving you with exactly what you built without me." Julian froze. The words struck him with the final, crushing weight of a gravestone. He had built nothing without her. Every success, every recovery, every moment of stability he had enjoyed for the last 3 years had been quietly funded and protected by the woman standing in front of him. Clara tilted her head slightly, the brilliant afternoon sunlight catching the sharp angle of her jaw. "A year ago, in a glass hallway 50 floors above us, you told me the truth," Clara said, her voice dropping into a quiet, intimate register that only he could fully hear, despite the chaos of the cameras around them. "You told me you only married me to forget her, and you told me to leave." Julian's mouth trembled. "I didn't mean it. I was sick. I was." "I told you to remember that goodbye, Julian," Clara interrupted smoothly, her voice as cool as the silver pen in her pocket. She looked at him one last time, archiving the memory of his ruined face, erasing the ghost that had haunted her for 3 years. "I hope you have an excellent memory," she whispered, "because this is the last time I will ever look at you." Clara Vance turned her back on him. She walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped out into the brilliant, blinding light of the afternoon sun. The warm city breeze caught her dark hair. The noise of the traffic and the pulse of the world swallowed her in a vibrant, living embrace. Behind the glass, Julian Thorne collapsed to his knees on the cold marble floor, surrounded by the blinding flashes of the press, trapped forever in the shadow of the woman he had thrown away. Clara did not look back. She had an empire to run,